Good morning to everybody. Good afternoon to Dr. Veera Singh and Professor Atu Koral, who are joining from the Australia. And also good evening if anybody is joining from the North American side. I am Gunatilaka Herat. Some of you may not know me. I was a former professor at University of Peradeniya, and later I was a former director at Asian Development Bank. This is the first of a series of webinars jointly organized by Sri Lanka Economic Association, Sri Lanka Forum of University Economists, and Sri Lanka Agricultural Economic Association. On behalf of all three associations, I warmly welcome you for this very important webinar. Let me briefly explain the purpose of the webinar series. Actually, no need to say that we all are aware of the current tragic economic situation in Sri Lanka. Now, we all are feeling the pain, of course, to varying degrees, depending on our individual economic stances. And the three economic associations agreed to conduct this webinar series with the objective of developing a comprehensive reform strategy, put Sri Lankan economy back to an inclusive and sustainable path of growth, and also to prevent the economy getting into similar kind of crises in the future. And as we know, the crisis is evolving and unfolding. And now we are in a transition period. We don't know how long this transition period will last. I think it is not easy to predict. But once the production patterns, trade flows, prices, employment, poverty level, and so on and so forth are settled, we will end up in a kind of a low-level equilibrium. I think that may be the time for us to undertake serious reform. So that will give us some time, and we are planning to do this webinar series and get the best economists Sri Lanka produced so far to speak to us so that based on their input, we can develop this economic recovery strategy. Now, to reiterate the purpose of this webinar series, we have two objectives. First one is to educate our membership. I hope these well-educated economists will not be offended when I say educate, because as I understand, a comprehensive recovery strategies need every small branch of economics to be considered. Not only initially, probably we need to concentrate more on monetary policy and financial market and credit side, but then we have to go into all the other aspects. So since we have specialized in some areas of economics and worked a long time on those areas, it is a good thing to listen to the best economists who have worked on each and every thematic area to update ourselves. That is the first objective. The second is to develop this comprehensive recovery strategy. And we are planning to use this strategy, develop this strategy using a consultative and inclusive process so that it can be presented as a unified approach of Sri Lankan economists. I think since all three associations are involved, we can present it as a unified strategy produced by all the economists in the country. I think it is my duty to explain you a little bit about the process through which we came to this stage. Initially, personal level, couple of us, Dr. Professor Veera, Dr. Atapattu, myself, and couple of others, we discussed, how should we do something about this crisis, and then this idea of having a webinar series came to our mind, and we approached Sri Lanka Agricultural Economic Associations to get what they think about it. To our pleasant surprise, they were so keen to work on that. And then we, through the Sri Lanka Agricultural Economics Association, we approached the other two associations. And then actually all the three associations were equally keen to work on this. and they all recognize that as the need of the hour. So I'm I'm thankful to the office bearers of the three associations who have been since then actually cooperating with us to get this going. And in the process, we had a couple of brainstorming meetings, and then we appointed an organizing committee. Then I was appointed as the chair of this committee, and Dr. Sashika Ratnayak was appointed as the secretary. But we, as a whole group, we are working together on this. The first webinar on the series will focus on the causes of the crisis and then how it will probably unfold in the next couple of months. There's a lot of uncertainty in everyone's mind what will happen next. So we are trying to understand this in this seminar. And then our second seminar is also, we did the groundwork for the second seminar. Dr. Santa Devarajan already agreed to be the key speaker. We are going to have a committee meeting next Monday or so to finalize the details of the second seminar, as well as to discuss the next steps. What are the other topics for the next seminars, and so on and so forth. Before I introduce the speaker today, let me also state that the economic tragedy in our country is mainly due to ignoring economic principles in managing the economy. That's how I see it. And also the economic literacy among our leaders as well as the public is very poor. We need to work on both sides if you are going to implement a sound program of reforms. So many of us, including myself, we lived within our comfortable zones. We did our research in our special areas and did other things. So I think this comfortable zone professional work is no longer feasible given that the gravity of the crisis we are in. We all need to really put our heads together and then work on this economic crisis and help the country to get out of this crisis. And also, I think we need to remain apolitical in our professional work so that we can maintain our integrity and credibility while we are preparing the strategy. But once we have a sound strategy, we can invite the political parties and various other entities to, we can disseminate our results to anybody interested. I think along the way, however, we need to formulate a communication strategy. I think we need to get some media support as we are progressing towards the preparation of this. So I think that's all I want to say. Regarding the seminar today, the ground rules are as such. We will give about 40 minutes to our key speaker, and then we will invite the discussant. He will get about 25 minutes. And then after that, we will have about 15 minutes for the questions. Now, let me introduce the key speaker today. Our key speaker is Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, who obtained his PhD and master's degree from Australian National University, and he obtained a BSc degree from University of Kelaniya, Sri Lanka. He started his career in the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, and after 29 years of great service, he retired recently. During his central bank career, he held various positions, and he was the senior deputy governor at the time he retired. While serving the central bank, he held various positions such as alternative executive director for the International Monetary Fund, visiting research economists at the Southeast Asian Central Bank Research and Training Center in Malaysia, and visiting research fellow at the Australian National University. He is an advisory board member of the Center for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis at Crawford School of Public Policy in Australian National University. In his career at the central bank, Dr. Veerasinghe served as the chairman of the Monetary Policy Committee and the Foreign Reserve Management Committee, and chief economist and director of economic research. He has represented several cabinet subcommittees on economic matters. Despite being busy with the central bank career, Dr. Veerasinghe maintained his touch on academia. He taught at University of Colombo and published in international and national journals. Dr. Veerasinghe is known for his loyalty to economic profession and his dedication to manage the economy using sound economic principles. His 29 years of experience about implementing monetary policy in Sri Lanka and hands-on experience in preventing crises like this in the country is of enormous value to Sri Lanka, in particular to prevent this kind of crisis in the future. We are very fortunate to have him as the main speaker today, and we are very thankful to you for accepting our invitation. Dr. Veerasinghe, floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Unrathan, and also, first of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me for this very important forum. And also, I have to say, I'm very privileged to be on this panel, especially with Professor Premchandra Athukorala, whom one of the finest economists that Sri Lanka has produced, and also I was fortunate to work with him at the ANU when I was in PhD as a student. He was in my first panel as well. So it's a great pleasure and privilege to be in the panel with Professor Athukorala. So let me just share the screen first, and today I'm going to talk about my presentation. And hopefully one can see the screen. Let me go there. Yeah. So today, what I'm going to talk about in my about 40 minutes time is what is relevant is, first briefly I'll discuss what are the kind of causes of current economic crisis in Sri Lanka, and also, as suggested earlier, look at the outlook, how we are going to see unfolding the current crisis, and also the way forward in terms of policies and measures that what we think as economists, especially on macroeconomic management. I'm only focusing on, as I said earlier, on overall macroeconomic side. And as the chair mentioned, there will be a series of other seminars focusing on several other areas. So I'll be focusing mainly in an area that I'm quite familiar, which is overall macroeconomic management. So let me just start with the first slide, which basically give you an idea of the worsening economic fundamentals, overall macro fundamentals, what we see as a today. So I'll also show you some of the, if possible, some of the slides or pictures if time permits. Otherwise, I'll go through. This is a period of historically lowest economic growth. For example, last year, negative 3.4% was a lowest negative growth that we have seen. And also at the same time, per capita GDP has been falling since 2017 from just above $4,000 per capita, now is I think below 3,700. It is falling continuously from since then, from the peak of about $4,000 level. And as a result of the growth moving to a lower growth path since 2013, just if you look at historical data, since about 2000, we had the very high economic growth soon after the end of the war in 2009 up to 2012, about 8% growth. And since then, from 2013 onwards, its growth rate fall below about 3 to 5% path, and it came down to in 2019 about 2.3%, and then 20 negative, and this year probably a small positive growth. So we are moving into a relatively lower growth path compared to our neighbors and also compared to the potential that Sri Lanka can grow. And as a result, we had made very good gains in the past as a result of high GDP growth in terms of reducing poverty. Now, World Bank has estimated our poverty also now again increasing, and more people are falling into poverty, especially after this pandemic into 2020. As a result of poverty has been now rising, and also income inequality also rising. That is overall in terms of growth and the poverty. And other key economic imbalance that we are running, the second one is very high fiscal deficit that we are running since 1988. This year and last year, it's the highest fiscal deficits we have, our government has done since 1988. And on top of that, it is also lowest government revenue as a percent of GDP in the history of Sri Lanka in the last 70, say, whatever available data up to 75 years. It's the lowest government revenue is about 8% of GDP is the lowest. And as a result of low government revenue, the government expenditure on interest payments basically absorb 80% of the government revenue. So you think about the situation where government get $100, 100 rupees, as 80 rupees going to interest payments, then there are a lot of other expenditure government will have to borrow mainly to finance the balance expenditure. As a result, now government debts has become unsustainable levels, and also not only the current level is unsustainable, which is under 19% of GDP in 2021. If you look at future debt dynamics, looking at the debt obligation, external debt obligations, especially in next couple of years or 3, 4 years, 5 years, the dynamic is getting worsened unless it is addressed in terms of debt service. I'll come back to in detail later. So we are in this current worsening economic fund is the highest unsustainable debt levels, and it will move forward in the next few years as well. And the next one is most important, one of the most important one for central bankers is inflation. It's a key responsibility of the central bank, where now inflation is highest in 12 years. So if you look at the inflation data, it clearly shows in the last 12 years, central bank was able to maintain inflation around mid-single digit levels as a result of kind of a monetary policy central bank implemented somehow. So maintain inflation at least to a reasonable level at a low level. But now it is skyrocketing. And now last month, the National Consumer Price Index inflation went up to 17.5%, and CPI, Consumer Price Inflation based on Colombo consumer price, will come this year, this month, end of this month, will most probably exceed 20%, and is, in my view, that going to increase further in next coming months. It's too late to do anything about this. It's already prices are being, exchange rate and other things have been factored in, price levels are going up. Inflation is most probably will hit the historical highest, exceeding 28% we had in 2008 in a couple of months. Then what has caused one of the reasons with this high inflation through one is the supply side pandemic issues, other one is the very high aggregate demand, both external and domestic demand, through very high money printing or monetization of fiscal deficit by the central bank. This is a record highest level of money printed by the central bank in the last 2 years. That is basically one of the reasons why we are now experiencing kind of very high inflation. And also, not only the high inflation, when you have high overheating or excessive aggregate demand pumped through excess monetary expansion, then that will flow in two areas. One is to high aggregate demand that creates domestic inflation, and high external demand that will create balance of payment crisis. Or, for example, higher current account deficit, more demand for import of demand for foreign exchange for imports of goods and services, and compared to the income or earnings of foreign exchange. As a result, current account is going to be widened. So that is two effects. One is the current account deficit, other one is the inflation. So that we are experiencing both at the same time now. That is the macroeconomic imbalance right now we are experiencing. And the the other one is important in terms of solvency and the debt service of meeting debt service obligation of the country, external debt service obligation, level of external reserves are now, we all know, I think this is public knowledge, level of reserves are much lower than the next 12-month debt service obligation. It's about public figures say 2.3 billion, but usable resource we can all understand it's about $500 million available. But next 12 months we have to meet almost $6 to $7 billion of worth of debt service obligations, and also without having so long-term external flows, it's very challenging how we're going to meet external debt service payments in next 12 months with very low levels. So this is first time in 2020 and 2021 and this year, our flow levels were lower than the next 12 months. Just the first time in the history. That is one important point. And as a result, earlier also we had this current account deposits and low level of resource, but those days we had access to international capital markets, so that when there was stress, rightly or wrongly, Sri Lanka government had access to capital markets, so that if there's a deficit in the current account or external balance of payment deficit or balance of payment issues, successive government was able to raise external financing through issuance of inter-sovereign bonds and several other instruments, and so that we were able to finance the kind of a current account deficit we have been running in the past. So right now, it is also not there. As a result, rising current account deficit, it's difficult to finance this deficit without kind of having a stress and shortages in foreign exchange. That's what we are experiencing right now. So then those are economic fundamentals. Then this next slide, I will talk about what are the structural, short-term structural issues, near-term structural issues. There are a lot of other structural issues that we can discuss in later seminars on a lot of other areas. But I'm talking about in terms of overall macroeconomic management. First one is, right now we are experiencing highest ever losses made by two large state-owned enterprises, CPC and CBC, petroleum and electric board. We never had this kind of losses in the past, so this is the highest ever. That's one thing. Second, the highest ever rupee and foreign currency debt by CPC, CB, and Sri Lankan Airlines, three large government corporations, which have huge exposure to foreign currency debt. And with this kind of currency depreciation and also shortage of foreign exchange for them to meet their debt service obligations to state banks, this has become a significant risk, not only to those corporations, but also the banking sector. This has a significant risk to financial system stability as well, because two state banks exposure to the government in terms of overdraft, which is about over $1 trillion now, which is also highest in the history, and also exposure to state-owned enterprises, especially in foreign currency, is huge and highest. So if there's any way, if government becomes insolvent or government becomes unable to meet government debt service obligations, and then this will spill over to corporations, and that will make two state banks under heavy stress, and they could become insolvent if they lead into banking crisis if that situation is not managed properly. This is, remember, right now we are experiencing a balance of payment crisis, shortage of foreign exchange, not a banking crisis. But this can lead into a banking crisis if we don't address it now, because the exposure and risk levels of the two state banks is very, very high. And in the situation, if this current situation, because there has been no proper measures implemented on time, we are too late now. The current situation most likely will be worsening further before it turning around. So it can be turning around. That's the possible thing that I have to say. It will not last forever. At some point, it will crash and come out, or with policies, it can be smoothened out and turn around, whatever the way. So, but still, all we can do is to minimize more pain, and we cannot prevent more pain going forward in the next couple of months. whatever we are going to do now, because we need very significant, difficult reforms to implement soon than later. This pain can be minimized only if those policies are implemented in the immediate future without any delays. So that's on the near-term issues. Now let me just focus on what are the causes that led to precipitation of current crisis. I would, basically classify that into two categories. One is long-term structural issues that contribute to weakening economic fundamentals. For example, now there are certain issues; those are not necessarily a fault of this government or last government. Those are legacy issues coming or a successive governments. Those are issues that has been lingering over and not addressing, and it's still going on. So those are legacy issues, I would say, long-term structural issues. Second part are the short-term policies. So when you are having this long-term structural kind of issues without being addressed, when the country is faced with the external shock, plus the pandemic and also the reversal of certain policies, then it could certainly trigger economic crisis. Earlier, what I said, weakening economic fundamentals because of the structural issues. Second one is triggering crisis as a result of partly the pandemic, not the full reason, and mainly due to the not implementing right policies at the right time. So let me elaborate on those two areas before I conclude. So the long-term structural issues that has been coming for the last 15, 20 or years, and if you look at fiscal deficit that I mentioned earlier, is only this year highest ever, but still, if you look at Sri Lanka's fiscal deficit from 1977 onwards, since the liberalization, average fiscal deficit, when I look at 1977 to up to 2008 time period, up to 2008, average was almost 9.5% of GDP of the fiscal deficit. You can imagine a country, I don't know any country, which has run a large, long-term, that kind of fiscal deficit, meaning less revenue, more expenditure, and then you fill that through borrowing, either concessional borrowings.
Recording in progress.
So in the past, earlier part, there was a lot of concessional financing, so it was sustainable because very low interest rate and long-term loans. So that went on, and then we came to a situation where we move into a kind of a low middle income category. Our access to concessional finance was coming down, and as a result, we had to rely on more commercial financing, and still that went on the running high fiscal deficits. And as a result, now the deficit, fiscal deficit and debt has become unsustainable. So this is a long term. So this is not only by this government, not by last government, it's running from historically. Then the other one is a fiscal dominance of monetary policy. This is also not a new one. Whenever government is running high fiscal deficits, central bank had to, or central bank was forced to finance part of the fiscal deficit to a certain extent for a period of time. If you look at even from 1977 onward, there are a period very high monetary expansion, very high monetization of fiscal deficit from time to time. But there are times where it had been managed, and that is where we see some low inflation. But a lot of period average inflation from 1977 to 2007 is about 12% on average. Very high, relatively very high in Sri Lanka compared to our peer countries. And also that is a reflection of monetary policy, fiscal dominance of monetary policy and accommodative monetary policy to facilitate high fiscal deficits done by the government. And as a result, we had seen repeat cycles of burst of payment crisis, and we had gone to the IMF 16 times. But what happened basically when you go to the IMF, we fix that temporary and then go back to square and then just forget about those policies and then continue the bad practice. And also the other structural is long-term one is as I mentioned earlier, we switch into commercial borrowings to finance government expenditure, which are less productive. I'm not against the external borrowings, because when the country is having a large savings investment gap, cutting current account deficit, obviously the country needs to borrow externally. Only the issue is that when the government is borrowing externally on commercial terms, if that money funds are not spent on less productive expenditure, which would not increase the capacity of the country to earn foreign exchange, then obviously we are going into trouble. That is basically, if you look at commercial financing we started going issuing inter-sovereign bonds capital markets in 2007. I was also involved in that process from that time onwards. And first 500 million dollars, and then we have it. Now the total external debt, starting from 5% commercial debt, now we are over 50% are basically on commercial debt, that government external borrowing. So that is where now we are in a situation. And it's okay if that 50% of commercial borrowing had been invested properly so that country's foreign exchange earning capacity had been increased, then obviously we would not be in this kind of situation. The country can earn foreign exchange to meet all these future debt service payments. Now we have not done that. As I said, now we are finding it difficult and struggling to meet debt service payments. And the cycle of repeating cycles of borrowing and meeting debt service payments, this is going on, and this is the only way right now until we address all these long-term structural issues. And if you look at where this money went on, the large fiscal deficits mainly based on driven by recurrent expenditure, like expanding the government labor force, salaries, wages. I'm not objecting to increase the salaries and wages pension. That has to happen with inflation. But when at some point we had public sector employees about 600,000, also went to 1.5 million. It's also okay if these public sector employment are very productive and they are contributing to the growth in economy and contributing to foreign exchange, then it is okay. But what has happened basically, this money went into the salaries, wages, and pensions. Didn't have kind of a sufficient productivity improvements and efficiency gains. As a result, the country has not been able to earn enough. And the next structural long-term issue again is the letting this large state on, as mentioned, is only this year, last year highest, but still there are several years in the past, this CPC, CEB, and Sri Lanka Airlines have been operating on huge losses, and banks have been financing all the losses I mentioned earlier. And when this obviously when these corporations are making losses, either government will have to finance also, but in what happened in Sri Lanka, this whole basically the burden on the banking sector, see, two state banks, they had to finance all those losses in terms of foreign currency and domestic loans, as I mentioned earlier. And the state banks are kind of forced to finance these increasing losses of the state-owned enterprises. As a result, I mentioned these banks are also now exposed. And the other important issue, why, when we talk about why we have not been able to, increase exports of goods and services, export income, foreign exchange earnings, is mainly because of the kind of a trade policy. It has been moving towards more protectionist regime. There are domestic protection for domestic industries, those are targeting local market, has been relatively very high compared to tradable goods. Say non-tradable versus tradable. Protection for non-tradable has been increasing for last couple of years. It's a World Bank study already found that. This is one reason why we are not seeing diversified exports or exports going into different areas or growing sufficiently. And also as a result, what we need to finance current one is a foreign direct investment, at least partly finance that. But what we are seeing, these foreign direct investments also have come into this kind of domestic oriented sector. For example, real estate, telecommunication, all these areas, we had seen large amount of foreign exchange. That does not, those things are good, not bad, but those are not necessarily generating sufficient foreign capacity to earn foreign exchange. Even through FDIs, the problem is that when foreign direct investment comes in, invest in all these areas, it's okay if we have huge economy like India, or this is a small open economy where we have to rely on exports. Then FDIs on export-oriented firms have been relatively very low. compared to earlier, this garment industry has come with foreign direct investment, but after that, I think I haven't seen a lot in export-oriented areas and services. So those are the long-term kind of issues that has been coming over a period of time. Then let me focus on another two slides, which is what are the short-term policy issues that led to the current economic crisis. So what I said earlier, that contributed to weak economic fundamentals, that we are not able to address the repeating cycles of balance of payment crisis and high inflation. But we have been able to manage somehow through borrowings and the actual capital markets. But now what caused the current crisis? Why that was stopped? This I'm going to explain now. This first one is in 2019 December. There's a biggest mistake of the current government is to reduce taxes significantly and reintroduce what they call long-term tax exemptions for so-called strategic development projects, which was suspended earlier, but it was reintroduced. Give 10-year, 15-year, 25-year tax concession or tax expenditure when your tax income is 8-9% of GDP. And even this foreign direct investment, so-called strategic investment, even domestic or foreign, they are not going to contribute anything to the economy or taxpayers. This all taxpayers' expenditure, those are supporting those projects. I mean, that is this one is the huge reduction in both VAT, income tax, and the reintroduction of taxation. That is the first short-term policy mistake that was done earlier in 2009. Still, that has not been reversed, unfortunately. And the second one, there was under the previous cyber program, there was a pricing formula introduced at least for petroleum products. Like there was a transparent petroleum pricing formula. It was supposed to increase or decrease domestic prices by protecting the cash component excise duties. And when prices global are increasing, then there's an automatic adjustment. That is how a lot of countries are managing petroleum prices. That was suspended in early 2020. And then for too long, the prices were fixed without adjusting, despite very low petroleum prices and very high petroleum prices still maintain the same domestic prices. That created that huge losses for CPC and also CG. And the third one, a lot of people have not talked about, analysts and media have not talked about this third factor. As you can remember, soon after the change in government in 2019 or 2020, the announcement was made by the Minister of Finance. The statement was made by the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary President. There will be no more external commercial financing by the government in the future. They said, make the decision, we are not going to borrow anymore on commercial terms. So that's fine. If there were no debt service obligation, then we can stop borrowing. When there are every year $4-5 billion maturing every year, when the government announces that we are not going to borrow anymore on commercial terms, then it is obvious to anyone that the government is going to default at some point. The government can maintain that policy only until whatever the reserve level, that are 7.6 billion reserve, are run out to meet the service obligation. After that, we don't borrow on commercial terms, then government is not going to be able to meet the service obligation. That was obvious. I mean, this is the reason why the rating agencies, when they saw this, rating agencies immediately downgraded Sri Lanka. So they saw the risk of external vulnerability. If government is not going to borrow any more commercial basis, at least to meet future service obligations. I'm not basically pursuing to borrow without a limit. At least to meet future service obligations, they are not going to raise sufficient external financing. Then obviously, it's like you are taking a loan from the bank and you are going to bankrupt, then you don't take another loan or something like that, then there's no other way that you will be in a frame. So it's something like this situation. This was the first mistake that government made the announcement. And if I can remember, before that there was a plan to raise some of the commercial finance from Japan on the basis of JB guarantee on a very consistent term. That was also suspended soon after the change in government, where it was said there's no more need for that kind of financing. We can manage with kind of towards remittances, and that's also a very mythical statement that was made. As a result, we rating is downgraded. What happened once rating is downgraded to triple C level, then obviously even if you want to borrow, you can't borrow because it's a default category, almost default category. So now we are out of the capital markets. We don't have any access to, we have been cut off from access to international capital markets, and we can't borrow even if we wanted. And this next one, the policy mistake that was done by artificially fixing the exchange rate from April to 2020 at 203. So that's basically it's no brainer. I mean, we were not going to borrow anything externally, and in the middle of the pandemic, economy was slowing down, and resources were about to decline because due to the debt obligations, and exchange rate was fixed at 203 by the central bank. And to maintain that peg, only way that central bank had to spend whatever the little resource that they had, a large amount of money had to spend to defend exchange rate at 203. That was one of the biggest mistakes that was done in the recent past. That is one of the key reasons for the current crisis. Obviously, that recently it was told that I talk about that that mistake separately next time in the next slide. And as a result, we are seeing huge black market premium, informal market for foreign exchange. We never had 20% black market premium for informal foreign exchange transaction in this country historically ever. From the day that 203 was fixed, from that day, black market, informal market trading at 240, 50, 60, it was going up gradually. And what happened basically, on the formal market, there were no foreign exchange available for essential imports like petroleum for the CPC, gas for gas companies, milk, pharmaceuticals for pharmaceutical corporation, those are not available. And whatever money coming from exports and remittances went to the informal market, all non-essential imports are financed through very high exchange rate. As I said, those not only the prices were those domestic prices of the non-essential imports, those are imported using black market exchange rate. They factored already high prices, factored 240 to 150 at that time. That's why inflation, one of the reasons inflation already started going up even before exchange rate depreciation or floating exchange rate, because people who imported non-essential other imports were already factoring $140 to $50 in their pricing. That has to happen, otherwise people can't make losses. This is then also there's one more slide on short-term policy mistakes, and this is what I mentioned already is the inflation and also the fixing exchange rate and printing excessive print of money, excessive monetary expansion through central bank financing is basically it's a recipe for the crisis. That's what happened in the last 2 years. Highest ever amount of central bank financing of the budget deficits. That how it was done. Policy interest rates were kept too low for too long, even after the pandemic. When pandemic effect was gradually relaxing, then still rates were kept. It's okay during a short period during the pandemic when countries were locked down. It's okay to keep low interest rates low and print some amount of money, but it became a practice. Until now, it's going on. This financing budget deficits by the central bank, and also not only that, monetary expansion, but also suppress market interest rates at artificially low levels. So that is that. As a result, when you have financial distress or suppress market interest rates, then you kill all the markets. On one hand, the local domestic secondary market for government securities. There was a very active secondary market for a period of time. It all basically killed the market. The first one. Second one, even domestic foreign market, it was also killed by the fixed exchange rate. So look at the volumes of foreign exchange transactions in the interbank market. It almost came down somewhere zero in the interbank market foreign transactions compared to 100 million, somewhere 120 million worth of transaction within the interbank. When you cap the price, obviously if there's no supply, obviously there's no liquidity. The both foreign market was killed, domestic secondary market, especially bills and market was killed as a result of this directed capping interest rates and the exchange rate. And to address that, there was some mechanism in the last time we drafted. These are long-term. To address earlier, I mentioned the long-term issues. We drafted the new central banking act, which should basically give some more autonomy for the central bank and also to address this long-term structural issues. The new central bank bill, which was intended to first strengthen autonomy and accountability of the central bank. Second, to establish the new monetary policy framework, which has worked well, to establish formally that what we call flexible inflation targeting regime that was able to bring down inflation around 5% over a long period of 12 years, to establish that and incorporate into the Central Banking Act, and also to limit direct monetary financing, directly central bank subsidizing the primary options and directly the pumping money into the system through budgetary financing. That also had limits under the law in the new bill. And also there's a new institutional framework to proper coordination of the monetary policy and fiscal policy that is necessary. But will have to be independent. Two policies, monetary policy, fiscal policy will have to be done independently with proper coordination. So there was an institutional framework built into the new act to do that, and also address the conflict of interest issues like Secretary of the Treasury sitting in the monetary board and making monetary policy interest rate decision is a clearly conflict of interest. That was addressed to a different monetary board institutional arrangement. These are necessary reforms for modern central banking, so that also this new bill only submitted to the parliament and the new government did not proceed, and this was to the bill now. We don't cite this. Then, so that let me have one couple of points to make on the pandemic, because there's a lot of discussion whether this pandemic has caused this crisis. We can hear a lot of stories about if there's no pandemic, we wouldn't have this issue. So let me just deal with that. Obviously, pandemic has some short-term impact on certain economic fundamentals. For example, in 2020, negative GDP growth is mainly as a result of lockdowns, restricted economic activity. As a result, economy contracted by 3.4%. If you want to have some kind of a quantification, is the way to do that is you look at the actual GDP growth projections before the pandemic that was done by central bank or IMF. You can see a lot of predictions for growth before the pandemic, and then you look at what the actual outcome. And the difference shows that what was expected earlier and what the actual outcome. The difference can be attributed to the pandemic and other measures. So if you look at Sri Lanka situation, 2020, projection was around, I think, 4 to 5%. Actual was negative 3.4%. So there's a 7% decline in terms of percentage points of the GDP. That also translates into reduction of per capita GDP by around $500 per capita during 2020. So one can attribute that also partly because of the pandemic. And also the reason for this decline, one is the restricted economic activities, and also the tourism also affected to a significant way because of the pandemic. That's partly contributed that. And what is interesting to note is that no one has highlighted this also. Who has borne the cost of pandemic-related expenditure? Who has paid for pandemic-related expenditure in Sri Lanka? Let me come back to the next slide just to show the numbers. This is based on Central Bank roadmap, the 6-month roadmap. I see they have updated recently one of the other presentations also. This first part is the total value of packages in 3 different ways during the pandemic. First one is monetary stimulus. In terms of monetary policy expansion, Central Bank itself says value of monetary stimulus is 2167 billion. It's about 14.5% of GDP. That is the biggest contribution coming from the monetary policy. That's huge monetary stimulus contributed to support the economy at this time. This is up to end September 2021, the numbers based on the roadmap. And the total value of fiscal stimulus, but the government contribution, what government spent on the pandemic related expenditure was only 209 billion. So which is about 1.4% or something like GDP. That is very small by the taxpayers. Then there's another mechanism where central bank offered debt moratorium to businesses, those who are running those. There are two things. One is a debt moratorium to giving them extended times to repay their debt obligation to banking sector. Other one is 4% interest scheme, low interest scheme, subsidized scheme, and low interest rates. So total value of that has been estimated at 780 billion. So that is those are the support packages. Then you look at who has borne the cost of it. Same percentage, and roadmap also presented that because of the low interest rates maintained by central bank, private sector has saved $365 billion, rupees during this period. What does that mean? Private sector has saved the interest cost by 365 million. Who paid that 360 million? Government did not subsidize the 360 million. It's all by the financial institution. They pass this cost to the depositors. That is why deposit rates for the pensioners, normal savers, net savers, they are the ones who paid in terms of low interest income for their saving deposits, 365 billion. Basically, that bill, not financed by the government or taxpayers, that financed by the saving people who are saving in this country, or basically people who deposit money in banks and financial systems. So as a result, their incomes went down. People who benefited interest savings, their incomes went up. I show another slide to show that. Then second part, Central Bank also estimated the government also saved 313 billion in terms of low interest rates during the same period. So when government saves 313 billion rupees in the interest payments to suppress interest, who is paying them? Payers are people who are investing in government securities. They are getting directed suppressed interest rates for their investment. Who are these investors? Large part are basically ETF and ETF. Lifetime savings of the private sector people whose funds have been used to finance the government subsidiary government interest payments by 313 billion. Which means these 2 years, effectively, this large part of this is a loss to return on ETF and ETF investors. Savings by the private sector people in this country, their savings have been taxed to subsidize government interest payments. That's the second point. Then third point was borne by taxpayers. It's only 209 billion as I mentioned. If you look at the net basis, government benefited 313 billion in terms of tax savings on interest payments. Spend on 209 billion, government is actually net beneficiary of COVID expenditure. If you look at net of that. So all basically have been funded by either the private sector savers who are invested in government securities and mainly ETF and ETF, and others basically pensioners, net savers, not the net borrowers. Net borrowers are basically their benefit because they also have deposits in the bank account, but because they borrow at low interest rate, on net basis they are saving. Net savers are pensioners, public sector people who have small accounts, all other savings accounts. These are the ones who pay for this cost expenditure. As a result, this is why income inequality has risen, and also poverty rates have increased because they were getting relatively lower income that they were supposed to get as a result of this policy by burdening the cost of pandemic on savers and investors from government securities instead of putting that burden on taxpayers, which is the standard way of doing every country, that has to be paid by current taxpayers or the future taxpayers, not by the people who are net savers or the investors like the private sector savers. That's the point. And also to prove that point, let me show this is based on profits of public listed financial non-financial companies, listed companies profits published by SEC. You can see 2020 and 2021, their profits has been rising historically highest level. Now the puzzle is that economy is negative growth. There's no economic activities, but these corporations or public listed companies, profits are historically high. So what are the sources? As I mentioned earlier, there are two sources. First one is the low tax regime, which save a lot of money or increase their profits. That's taxpayers' money that pass into high income corporates, that their profits are high. Second, suppressed interest rates, lower financial cost in terms of subsidized interest rates and suppressed interest rates, as well as their financial cost was much lower compared to earlier. So they made a lot of money. Historical highest amount of profits were made. This is actual data based on published from the financial institution listed in Colombo Stock Exchange. So this is another evidence to show that pandemic expenditure has been borne by relatively poor, that has contributed to high income inequality and higher levels of poverty. Now let me deal with the last part. What has been done by the government so far to address? So that is also important to discuss. So basically, they have done something that we have to acknowledge that so far. First point that started after this without doing anything, and then the good thing that in October 2021, Central Bank announced what they call 6-month roadmap, just to trying to address the issue. There was a plan and there are a lot of details, and this was announced, indicating that within 6 months all will be turned around and all will be fine and there's no issue. No need to go to the IMF, no need to restart the debt, no need to increase taxes, we will address that. And then there was a plan. So that was, in my view, was highly unrealistic even at the beginning. Just to make that comment. And what actually happened, if you look back, now 6 months is now complete. Almost end of this month is 6 months. Situation in fact got worse during this 6 months. And economic fundamentals move in completely opposite direction compared to the prediction in the roadmap. It's complete turnaround. And as a result, even before the completion of the roadmap period, government had to, and central bank had to reverse some of the policy and take certain measures on ad hoc basis. That's what I say ad hoc basis means it's not a proper sequencing way that things should have been done. But they did basically that those are right things. Only problem is the sequencing was wrong. It was on ad hoc basis. First one started to raise policy interest rate. That's fine. Interest rate will have to go up, but it was too little and too late. And second, they also removed the cap on yields on government securities. As a result, they're printing money, at least trying to scale down the amount of printing money by removing the yield on cap that was imposed by the Secretary of Treasury on the fiscal dominance. And that was basically removed. That was a good move. And as a result, interest rate market rates started going up. That was also now is moving again, rising, but still, again, in my view, that's also too late, not enough. And meantime, understanding that there is no kind of a financing system coming as planned in the roadmap, trying to bring some short-term credit facility like currency swaps and short-term credit lines to negotiate some with India and China. So that's obviously compared to the requirement to finance current account deficits and meet debt service obligation, these are hardly sufficient to meet those things. That will basically maybe sufficient to meet some of the expenditure on imports for next couple of months. After that, we will be back to square and we will have a lot more difficult time unless this is addressed. And also the other thing that a lot of people appreciated the central bank is they allow the currency to float. But my problem is that it was without addressing the root cause of currency depreciation, pressure on the currency and reserve. Letting the currency floating as the first step is a big mistake. Then that is why from 203 to now close to 300, every day 5 rupees, 10 rupees, currency continues to slide, depreciating. No one can stop that. Settlement has no resources to stop it. There's no policy measures to address the root cause of the currency depreciation, which is fiscal consolidation, increase in taxes, debt restructuring, pricing formulas. Usually the sequence is that you have to do first address the root causes, then gradually allow the currency depreciation so that you can manage the situation. This is now we are entering into vicious cycle of currency depreciation, inflation. Petroleum price will not go up again because no one can subsidize. This is going to be a vicious cycle of high prices, high inflation, and this will end up very bad if this continues. And also good thing, at least announced, initiated discussion with the IMF that was basically denied for long periods, saying that no need for IMF. Now at least this section president announced this, but that's also let's use and final assistance that has happened in very urgent. If you delay that, that will be, I mean, even now there will be more pain going through. No one can prevent the more pain, but still the pain can be minimized if we take immediate actions to fast track the debt restructuring and the financial assistance of the IMF. Then other donors can come and support the bridging financing. Another thing that there is one of adjustment in utility prices, for example, petroleum price, and the electricity prices are probably going to be adjusted. But with ad hoc increases without any transparent pricing formula, it's going to make it difficult. So that's the other thing. Then let me come to, I think, the last slide. What is the proper sequence? In my view, what should have been done to at least minimize the damage and minimize the pain and manage the economy to settle at least in 1 year. First one, multiple should have been tightened more by higher margins. Second, fiscal policy should have been tightened primarily by restoring the tax structure that was there earlier after this pandemic effect is over. Then also introduce pricing formulas to manage demand for petroleum and electricity. So they are shortage in both, and make sure to protect the excess duty component. And also important one for investors, make a very clear announcement that government has a genuine and clear intention to restructure sovereign debt, and also seek assistance from the financial assistance of the IMF, and immediately commence negotiation for debt restructuring financing without any further delay. More delay this process, more pain going to come in the future. On that basis of progress in negotiation, no point of asking for bridging financing now. The government will have to make some progress in negotiation, then only can ask some short-term help to navigate this deficit process. It will take about 6 to 12 months at least. So for that period, we need some bridging financing. So for that, then once some progress is made, then government can ask for help from the multilateral and bilateral kind of partners for the bridging financing until that happens. If not, we will have another kind of a hard default that's going to make things even more difficult. And once all these things have been done, then only allow exchange rate flexibly on a gradual basis, not a sudden float like doing that first thing, last thing first. This is what has happened. This has to be done on a gradual basis as a last step so that we could have managed this situation without and kind of just cycle of inflation, exchange rate, price adjustment, all these things now going to happen. And the important one is, as I mentioned, the risk to the financial sector through state banks that need to be addressed. That there should be a clear plan. If there's a stress on the banking sector, so two set banks, how do you deal with that? How the central bank and the Minister of Finance deal that kind of situation arises? That need to have a clear plan. Otherwise, if something happens to sovereign default or something, these banks are at a very high risk of kind of a situation, financial system stability concern. At the last slide, in conclusion, what I have to say finally, as I mentioned earlier, if those measures are implemented urgently, economy, in my view, can be stabilized within about 1 year. Still, there will be some more pain, but we can minimize the pain. But at the same time, as our chair mentioned, there are a lot of other medium to long-term structural reforms that has to happen in this economy to increase capacity of the economy to grow. That also can start parallel, but these things are urgent. You have to live in the short term to live in long term. Long-term reforms are not basically important at this point without basically, rescuing from current crisis situation coming up, then only gradually we can do that. Any significant deviation from this above path will have a lot more pains in terms of economic management and pain on the public, pain on a lot of people. There could be a lot of unrest by the people. So that needs to be prevented at any cost. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer. I'm happy, Dr. Atukorala.
Thank you, Dr. Veerasinghe, for your comprehensive, actually excellent presentation that explained the causes of this crisis, the long-term imbalances, the mistakes made by the current government in, the onset of the crisis, and then also some sort of a roadmap, at least now, if the government follow, that will minimize the pain. Thank you so much for your comprehensive presentation. Let me introduce the discussant. Actually, our discussant is Professor Premachanda Atukorala. In fact, there's no need to introduce him. I think most of you know him very well. But just for the formality, I will say a few words about him. He was a former professor of economics at Crawford School of Public Policy of Australian National University. In fact, he is one of the best economists produced by Sri Lanka. My statement will be justified if you look at his publication record, and he has published more than 550 papers in journals as book chapters, occasional papers, and manuscripts. And total citation he has received is more than 11,000 so far. And in his illustrious career, he provided advisory services to large number of international organizations, including World Bank, Asian Development Bank, UN agencies, as well as many developing country governments. Professor Atukorala maintained a very keen interest about the Sri Lankan economy. So he's a well-respected economist who possesses vast knowledge about economic crisis in Sri Lanka, because he has been working on these issues for a long time. I think without any further delay, I will invite Professor Atukorala to make his comment on the crisis. And we are very thankful to you, Professor, for accepting our invitation. Floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Hera. Thanks for the nice introduction. That I'm retired. Actually, I'm part of the emeritus faculty and still active in my academic work. I'm not fully retired. And I really enjoy listening to Dr. Nandlal Veerasinghe's presentation, very comprehensive. And in my comment, I will call him Lal, simply because at ANU, when we became close friends, we used to call him Lal. Therefore, I will call him Lal in my comment. The presentation was very comprehensive, and I'm going to make few observations about some of the material you covered, and then come up with some of my own views in order to provide further context to your rich discussion. And you nicely started with the current state of the crisis with up-to-date information. And then you discuss about near-term structural issues. and the impending dangers as well. Actually, one of the points you made in that section is very relevant to the Sri Lankan policy debate, but so far nobody has talked about it. It's a that is the possibility that the current crisis can turn out to be a banking collapse, which is a possibility. I remember Dr. Harsada Silva mentioning in the cabinet, then there are always already signs that one of the commercial bank is in trouble. I think perhaps Lal can make further comment on that issue. If this crisis spill over to a banking crisis, if the government doesn't take initiative to prevent that, I think it can be a calamity. And as he mentioned later in his discussion, government had declared policy of not borrowing commercially from international sources, but they shifted the burden onto government banks, and national bond issues denominated in dollar terms were issued to these banks, and they have a huge currency foreign exchange exposure. That can be a very vulnerable point in our economy. We need to think more about that important issue. Then he discussed in detail causes that led to the crisis, nicely divided into long-term structural issues and short-term policy issues. Relating to the long-term structural issues, he highlighted the point that the fiscal crisis has deep roots, but it became aggravated because of some short-term policies, particularly after the ending of the civil war. Massive borrowing and using them mostly to expand in non-tradable sectors. And he highlighted the anti-export bias in the economy. I would like to add some calculations I made using input-output table and incentive structure figures in 2015-16 database. Actually, things would have aggravated. Anti-export bias has increased very significantly. Producing for the domestic market is about 60 to 70% more profitable than exporting. Therefore, export to GDP ratio has plummeted from about 2010. If you look at the national account data. Again, foreign investment environment, you talked about trade bias, anti-export bias would have discouraged foreign investment coming to export industries. But in addition to that, there was an admin reason, the operation of the BOI. Many investors I talked to said that it was called one-stop shop earlier, but it is one more stop for an investor. There was a so-called second BOI operating in the other tower of the World Trade Mission, where all the under-the-table deals happened. All these things led to deteriorating the earlier effective role of BOI. And I analyzed data as part of a World Bank study using firm-level investment approval. And the number of companies left the country between 2000 and 2010, 270 odd firms had closed down business because of the unfavorable investment environment. Therefore, we need to add admin issues as well, in addition to the anti-export bias, which created these foreign exchange issues. And then relating to short-term problem, actually, as a central banker, you know the insider story. You made one important point, very important point. That means the present government came up with a policy statement saying that we are not going to borrow commercially in world capital markets. Actually, it was a killer message, as you correctly said. Then they shifted the burden not only to local financial institution, but also particularly to central bank, to fiscal pump priming, right? And I think this point we need to elaborate. I think it's a nice topic for a separate paper. I think it was partly based on misinterpretation
Recording
of
stopped.
What you call
Recording in progress.
Modern monetary theory. Modern monetary theory, popularized by Stephanie Kelton. I have this book. I don't think Sri Lankan policymakers have read it, but they have simply copied her title, Deficit Myth, saying that we can expand, create money without any damage to growth projects, prospect of a country. In that guise, they ignored world capital market and started fiscal fund priming in this country. This lady wrote this book with a very important caveat. She said, my theory is applicable only to countries with international monetary sovereignty. That means countries which do not issue bonds or other borrow money in foreign currency at an agreed exchange rate. Actually, that's what we have been doing all the time. After the first international bond issue in 2015, we were obliged to repay debt at a fixed exchange rate. Therefore, we did not have international monetary sovereignty. A country like that, fiscal pump priming is going to be a recipe for disaster, right? Either the former central bank governor did not want to disclose it, or he simply did not understand the underlying theory. And the policymakers were very happy. Oh, we don't have to borrow internationally. We can create money as much as we want. We are safe. That mentality actually impacted on these short-term problems created by the government. I think that's an interesting point that you made. And then you discuss about pandemic management. And again, the figures are very interesting. What the point you delivered is that in other countries in the region, government use fiscal policy in order to help the poor, the cushion, the living standard of the poor against the pandemic shock. But in Sri Lanka, what has happened is that pandemic measures taken by the government has enriched. Income disparities would have increased. And you highlighted that point very clearly. And then policy measures so far, basically what your message is that so far there hasn't been a cohesive, coherent policy response from the government toward the crisis, to solve the crisis. And again, you made the important point, under the previous government's structural adjustment policy package agreed with the IMF, revenue-based structural adjustment policies had been implemented successfully. They brought the primary deficit of the budget back to balance. Now, these policies were successors were basically ignored. New tax reforms, concessions were given. All these things contributed to widening fiscal deficit. And then you clearly point out that there is no other alternative but to enter into a IMF-based structural adjustment program. I fully agree your policy prescription. I think I have got another about 5 minutes. Can I use it to make some specific comments? In addition to the minor points I made relating to Lal's presentation, I would like to make 3 specific comments. The first point I want to make is that when you look at Sri Lanka's post-independence economic growth trajectory, actually Sri Lankan average growth has not been bad. It was real per capita income growth from about 1960 until 2019 was around 3.5, and which is not different from 3 other countries which I have been comparing with Sri Lanka to derive some policy lessons. These are Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. In 1960, our per capita income in dollar terms was higher than in Indonesia and virtually comparable to that of Thailand. And Malaysian per capita income was about 2 times higher, right? But over time, what has happened is that our growth trajectory has been much more unstable, ups and downs all the time, facing macroeconomic crisis. And eventually, when it came to 2019, what had happened is that Indonesia, which was well below us in the per capita ranking, had surpassed us. And the Malaysian per capita income, around 11,000, was about 3 times higher than ours. And Pakistan, with the Thailand per capita income, which was comparable, but was more than double of the Sri Lankan amount. What it shows is that macroeconomic policy really mattered. We started with comparable conditions, but eventually we have ended up with in an entirely different world, even though the average growth rate has been similar across the countries, very similar across all these 4 countries. It was mainly because always we have been facing upturn and downswing in our growth patterns. Unlike other countries, we had entered into stabilization agreements with 16 times in that period. Whereas Malaysia, Thailand, or Indonesia, they had entered into IMF agreements in the 90s. And after that, they have been basically very strong macroeconomically with huge foreign reserve base and relatively stable macroeconomies. And many people, researchers have tried to understand the growth story of Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. Actually, these lessons are very important for us. And what they find is that when it comes to macroeconomic side, their business environment is repleted with corruption, again, patronage, and rent-seeking activities. things are not that rosy when it comes to microeconomic side, particularly when we compare these countries with more developed East Asian miracle countries. However, the secret for their relatively better performance compared to Sri Lanka is sound macroeconomic policy. Professor Gordon has coined the term that macroeconomics orthodoxy. And in these countries, even though political inferences are very prominent in micro side, the macro policy making organizations, central bank, finance ministry, treasury, and these places have been run by technically efficient people. Their careers are much more prestigious in the country compared to other arena of economic performance. And their operations have been insulated from the messy micro side of the country, right? And then because of that reason, they have experience in relatively stable exchange rate and open economies and fiscal and monetary policy basically according to the conventional line. Because of that reason, not only their growth rates are high, but they have been more stable. But this is the biggest lesson from these countries for Sri Lanka. For Sri Lanka, again, when the countries face a macroeconomic crisis, they solve it immediately, and they face the massive East Asian financial crisis. But within 2 years, they came out of the crisis. Now, when you look at what happened in Sri Lanka, as Lal correctly pointed out, even though COVID complicated the situation, we got into the crisis because of long-term macroeconomic ailment in the country. But still, we have not taken a concrete, comprehensive policy response to the crisis. And this point, I think, provide nice setting for the very rich story made by Lal in his presentation. The second point I want to make is the policy response. And in order to put Dr. Weerasinghe's presentation in context, I would like to say that policy response so far has been basically muddling through, right? And picking up some issues and trying to address them without thinking about the overall economy-wide nature of the problem we are encountering. Actually, when I mention this, actually the proverbial Indian story about the 7 blind men who tried to identify the elephant come into my mind. Somebody who touched the trunk of the elephant said that elephant is like a snake, right? Somebody who touched the belly of the elephant, the blind man, said that, oh, elephant is like a stone. Or a third man who sensed the big ears of the elephant say that, oh, elephant is like a fan. We know in fan. Like that, what in our policy debate, they try to identify the elephant's parts, like blind element, and trying to fix up individual element. But it is not going to work. Lal made the point that interest rate floating, exchange rate floating is not good policy. It can lead to a calamity simply because when you allow the exchange rate to float, it can lead to massive budget fiscal problem, because as he mentioned, 80% of government revenue goes to debt repayment. Now, interest payment and debt repayment is going to increase massively because of the exchange rate floating. Now it is about around 280 cents per dollar. Again, still import controls are very binding. In that context, simply floating the exchange rate is not going to erase the foreign exchange black market, right? And again, inflation is going to be much higher because of the exchange rate floating. Exchange rate floating had to come as a package. And I heard somebody saying in the parliament that now we are doing what IMF asked us to do. IMF would never ask the country in this polity mess up to depreciate only the exchange rate, to float the exchange rate. We need a policy mix. That's why we need to go to the IMF. And so far, the policy response has been ad hoc, trying to build with individual elements in the macro picture without taking an all-encompassing approach. And Lal's presentation made that point clear. Finally, what are the prospects? I'm going to expand a little bit about what Lal made in his excellent presentation. There is no alternative but to go and enter into a stabilization package with the IMF. As he correctly pointed out, we need to open our access to foreign international financial markets. You can't do it without a sound IMF package. And again, IMF package, of course, IMF interest rate is going to be low. That is not the only advantage. IMF money does not go to the treasury to waste on various government projects and all that. This money strictly come to the central bank as balance of payment support, right? When that happen, one of the conditions of the IMF is that we need to remove quantitative import restrictions. You can't get IMF money coming to the central bank to support stabilization package while keeping quantitative import restrictions. Import tariff can be maintained at high level, it is acceptable, but the quantitative restrictions have to go. When that happens, a lot of upheaval in the economy created by foreign exchange shortages and import control is going to go. Actually, therefore, the IMF package is going to be more palatable politically than what people think. Many people argue that when you go to IMF, people are going to worse off. I do not think so. Removing import quantitative restrictions would address many problems, including relating to unavailability of milk powder, fertilizer, and so on. And another related point is that IMF policy advocacy has changed dramatically over the last 2 decades. IMF is not against welfare policies and social welfare provision in a country. They are more concerned about fiscal profligacy. And in Sri Lanka, as again Lal mentioned in the presentation, much of the fiscal budget expansion has been mainly because of politically driven policy initiative. Say, when you look at Samudri, and I have seen the recent data, Samudri is not poverty alleviating. Much of money goes to high-income people. They are people above the poverty line. That is room for rationalizing these expenses. Again, he made the point that tax to GDP ratio is the lowest historically. Now it is 8%. There is plenty of room to restructure the tax structure, reintroducing some of the wise taxes introduced by the previous government. That can be done. Again, strange thing with the recent budget, actually it is unique in the region. This is the only country to expand military expenditure in the context of COVID. And other countries have increased welfare expenditure on welfare program, but the prominent element in our recent budget expenses was military expenses. And again, a lot of money had been allocated, regional development councils and others. I think these are very politically appealing things from the point of view of the government. There are many ways the fiscal consolidation can be achieved without sacrificing or compromising welfare policies or poverty alleviation policy. Finally, actually, Sri Lanka is not really a failed state like many African countries which are in debt crisis. Thanks to liberalization reform initiated in 1977, we have a much more dynamic economic structure. Under correct stabilization package, actually, the economy has the ability to recover. We have a vibrant private sector. Production base is also much more broad-based compared to 1970, and entrepreneurs are more outward-oriented. And with all these preconditions, under sound structural adjustment package, I think we have hope. We do not have to be too pessimistic about our future. What is needed is sound policy and political leadership. With that, we can come out of the crisis. Of course, there will be pain, but I think we should not consider the future as that bleak for the country. I'll stop at that point. I'll thank again to Lal for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Professor Atukara, for your very valuable intervention. In fact, in the crisis and how it evolved and what we need to do seems very complex, but at least we were able to get some basic understanding about what caused the crisis and how to move forward in correcting the economy. Now we are coming to the question and answer session. Since we already utilized little more time than we planned, let me first read a couple of questions that are directed to Dr. Veerasinghe so that he can answer them. And then I will invite the participant to type their questions in Q&A session. Even if we cannot answer them all in this session, probably the presenter and the discussant will probably they have time. If they have time, they can answer to you on these questions. We can post them in our repository. You know that we have created this repository that we are going to upload all the presentations and even the recording of the video so that you all can download and read it if you miss anything. Now, in terms of questions to Dr. Veerasinghe, there's one question regarding the central bank. It says, in my assessment, the central bank has not been played its role properly to manage the fiscal and monetary policy. Actually, it should be monetary policy, just because of the political interferences. I think that is one, probably it's a comment. And another question asks about what kind of short, medium, and long-term reforms we need in the country. I think we touch upon in the presentation, but if you can summarize it a bit, that would be great. And third is directing at, again, Dr. Veerasinghe, asking that you were holding a very senior position in the central bank, and what prevent this central bank, why central bank was unable to prevent this crisis, because some of these long-term imbalances you describe have contributed to the crisis, and then later actually the wrong policies and wrong interventions recently aggravated the crisis. But his question is why central bank was not able to prevent this crisis. I think we can answer another set of questions later, but Dr. Veerasinghe, can you answer these three questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I'll start with the last question I can remember well. Why central bank was not able to address this, what I mentioned, the structural long-term issues that I mentioned, even we have been central bank for so long period. That what I mentioned here, basically, we need to understand what the role of the central bank. We have a specific role given by the Monroe Act, by like all the central bank. It is economic and price stability and financial system stability are two key objectives. So when it comes to the issues that I explained and highlighted as weakening economic fundamentals and the structural issues, so that's not necessarily all issues that central bank can deal with, given the mandate. So if I explain again, this is monetary policy mandate is to maintain stable, low and steady inflation with a steady economic growth. That's a economic and price stability means that thing. So if you look at, as Professor Premithandra also mentioned, our economic growth, although volatile, is not too bad historically. The economy has been not that stable, but has been growing at a relatively reasonable rate in the past. And also the inflation, that I admit that there has been a failure. So central bank, as I mentioned, mainly the weak governance structure, monetary policy, fiscal dominance in monetary policy. As a result, central bank has not been able to implement prudent monetary policy all the time to achieve what they call price stability. But if you look at last 12 years, we have been able to achieve price stability by implementing kind of a monetary policy. That is what was going to be implemented in the next stage to incorporate those into an institutional framework. But if you look at historically, central bank has not been able to maintain even price stability. Inflation had been around 12%. If you look at 1977 to 2009, that period. But still, the reason, as I mentioned, is that it's the fiscal dominance. When you need to have a coordinated, coherent macroeconomic policy coordination between fiscal and monetary policy together to stabilize the economy and address all these issues, plus structural reforms. So the central bank is not has no mandate and no instruments, authority to address a lot of things that I mentioned. Even to address some of the issues like fiscal dominance, we need to revise the current Monroe Act, change the legislation so that gives more authority to the central bank to implement independent monetary policy and also proper coordination. Then only that can be addressed. So this one is an institutional and governance framework that is weak in Sri Lanka, and also lack of coordination between fiscal and monetary authorities. Have a comprehensive both on one page in terms of what has to be done. and also lack of other structural reforms like state-owned enterprises, the banking reforms, a lot of things. Basically, if you look at financial system stability, so far, financial system stability has not that bad, except for some of the finance companies failing over several years, a few companies, but banking system, financial system has been stable so far. And also, I would make that comment here because financial system, what I mentioned is that there's a risk if this is not addressed, but there's no financial instability even now in Sri Lanka. Right now, it's not there. Although there are a lot of talk about People's Bank, I would say that is a misperception. Central bank system stability is still there. Banks are still stable. But if you don't take the measures to address the risk, then we could end up in system instability. That's what I mentioned. There's a warning. That is the answer to why. I mean, a lot of people think central bank is the one that has to address all this. That is why we have several ministries. We have a Minister of Power and Energy to address issues in power and energy. They have a Minister of Agriculture to address in the agriculture sector. Central bank cannot intervene on this. Central bank can only give policy advice to the government. It's up to the government to accept. Central bank's authority only to implement monetary policy and manage currency and the reserves, and also agency function and debt management. That's a different function. That's question to first one. I think there was one thing. I don't think I want to respond on some of the comments. If you can please, Professor, remind me what are the other two. I can't know. Forget about the other two issues. Briefly, if you tell me, I can just respond. You are muted. I can't hear you.
There were some other comments. One of the comment is that it is regarding what is your opinion about the recent comment made by Professor Steve Hank that Sri Lanka should dump the rupee and install a currency board to save the economy? Similarly, there was another comment which might be related to this. Let me put that also so that you can answer both. Don't you think with the support of IMS, I think it must be IMF, it is vital to anchor Sri Lankan rupee to US dollar hard currency policy to stop collapsing rupee due to risk of debt sustainability? Hong Kong from Asia, Bahamas from Caribbean islands, and many oil-based Middle East countries are examples for this. I think, can you answer these two, Dr.
Yeah, that's two very important questions, and I'm glad that someone raised that question. Both are, in fact, related. The question basically is that why don't we go to a kind of currency board that we had before 1950, before central bank was established, and why don't we have a kind of a currency to peg to the reserve currency like dollar, like obviously your candidate is a dollar. So I mean, in practice, it looks kind of a feasible on paper, but I have to say this is. I mean, in theory, it looks like it's okay, but in practice, this is impossible. And for Sri Lanka to have a currency board or currency to be pegged to a strong currency like dollar or global currency, you would have a much more disciplined macroeconomic policies. Like you can't have running huge fiscal deficits like what we have been running. And also you can't have this kind of a large external debt levels and this service in maturing these things, and also large current account deficits. So basically, if we had the currency board when we have currency, I mean, if you look at the countries those have successfully maintaining currency boards are mainly in the Middle East. Those are petroleum income current account surplus countries. They can maintain the exchange rate or currency, defend the currency at any rate with a credibility, so there will be no collapse. When Hong Kong, Singapore, those are very large trading economies and large current account surplus countries, they also can maintain. And it's like, now we have come this way and we have all these macro issues right now we are facing. If we fix the currency, it's just no way. If we have currency board, you need to have a sufficient resource in our, say, at least 15-20 billion resource to maintain this, at least address the short term the current account deficit and large debt service obligation. So it is bound to fail one after the other if we go for a currency board or peg the exchange. This is what was tried. Pegging the exchange rate is what the last 2 years the central bank was trying to peg the exchange rate at 203. That's impossible. It's not sustainable. You need to have a different kind of macroeconomic environment to have a currency board and also different economic structure. You will need to have either resource-based kind of a country where you can earn a lot of, like Middle Eastern countries, so large current account surplus countries. And even countries like China can, if they want, they can maintain a peg exchange rate because they're a huge current account surplus country. So first you need to convert country, address macro fundamentals, bring the fundamentals into a situation like there are no imbalances in fiscal, monetary and current. Then one can consider then obviously there will be stable currency. You don't need to fix a currency. Then the pressure is that, like in China and Japan, is that because of that their pressure is currency is appreciating. Although they can maintain a fixed currency or currency board, why don't they do that? Because it's also not good. They allow the flexibility in the currency. That is, you give the monetary policy autonomy to the country. Once you fix the currency or monetary board, you give up the monetary policy autonomy. You don't have the instrument to manage monetary policy, address the domestic kind of external shocks coming into the country and cushion that impact. To prevent volatile growth and inflation, you need monetary policy. That's why you need the independence, autonomous monetary policy as a central bank. Monetary authority will give up that. But giving up that, what you get is that linked to another currency. If that is stable currency, there will be stability. So the domestic inflation may be stable compared to its linked to dollar. Like the India, Nepal and Bhutan, highly integrated to India, that makes sense. So India, those countries have a currency board like peg to Indian currency because highly integrated. But we are not highly integrated to US dollar. By fixing our currency into another currency which has not basically highly integrated, that's bound to fail. And this is why European Union are highly integrated economies. So they all are basically kind of currency board with the euro. So that is relevant for them. But for us, I don't think that's why you don't see in Asia, other than Hong Kong, there's no other currency board. And I think Brunei probably, I don't know if fixed to Singapore, there's highly integrated with Singapore and Brunei. Other than that, I don't think that's a good idea. I mean, it's like, asking, so analogy is like, say, for example, in my case, say, I have been playing golf for several years, 10 years. And I'm got used to that thing. So I'm body, everything is basically equipped to play golf. All of a sudden, if someone is asked, no, it's better for you to play tennis now. That will kill me. I mean, that will have problems in my knees. I'm not quite used to that kind of thing. I have to completely change my structure and change my kind of the body, all these things to be adopt that new environment. So that is a huge structural change. We need to go into that kind of currency board. Without doing all these things, I mean, currency board obviously failed because that we have tried several times to fix exchange rate. First thing, you should be able to maintain a peg exchange rate. Several times we have tried and failed. The currency board will be repeating cycles of failing currency board if we go for that kind of thing.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Veera Singh. Now I will direct 2-3 questions to Professor Athukoral. One of the participants are asking, do you have full confidence that the package of IMF will be successfully materialized? That is question number 1. Question number 2, Professor Atukorala's point on getting right technical capabilities in macro policy making and getting central bank autonomy in Sri Lanka. What is your view? Probably the question is that you want the participant want you to elaborate on these 2 points, technical capabilities and the autonomy of the central bank. The third question actually is coming from me, Professor. Now you said that after keeping the fixed exchange rate at 203 per dollar, devaluation was correct policy, but it has to come with a package. It is, since it came without that package, it is creating more pain and difficulties for the economy. Can you elaborate what should be in this package? Some people are talking about increasing the interest rate. Some people are talking about, since we don't have immediate solution to our balance of payment, keeping the import restricted selectively. So are these kind of the things that we should have done together with the devaluation, I mean, floating the currency? Appreciate your elaboration on that.
Yeah. Let me start with the exchange rate issue, simply because there are 2 other people who had asked similar question, whether we should peg it to dollar, whether we should go for currency board, and here a point, my question about what are the other elements, component in the policy package needed. Now, the basic point I want to make, and Lal has made that point too, exchange rate is one instrument in the policy package, right? And its effectiveness very much depend on whether it comes as part of a more comprehensive macroeconomic stabilization package. In economics, we teach students in preliminary economics the so-called Timbergen rule. Timbergen rule means that when we are confronted with many issues, we need many policy instruments, not only one. If you try to achieve everything with one, it's not going to work. Now, in that context, firstly, the currency board issue, as Lal mentioned, it is not going to be politically acceptable, right? You have to completely sacrifice your macroeconomic policy autonomy. And no independent country in the world would agree to do that nowadays. Even Singapore Monetary Authority is not a full currency board. It's a mixture of currency board element, exchange rate management, and central bank activities. Only failed states in South America had resorted to currency board as an act of last resort. We can't talk about currency board in Sri Lankan context. Now again, whether the exchange rate need to be fixed to the dollar, it is okay as so long as we have other complementary policy. Particularly, budget deficit has been a major source of macroeconomic instability in the country. Without addressing the budgetary issues, without achieving fiscal consolidation, if you simply allow the exchange rate to float, it will backfire, because 80% of government revenue goes to debt repayment. Now, 80% of debt repayment is basically foreign currency denominated. Therefore, budget is going to blow up. At the same time, when you have import restrictions, allowing the currency simply to float is not going to address the black market issue. Actually, black market rate will go up, and then the official rate also will go pari passu with the exchange rate. Therefore, the basic idea is that exchange rate has to be one policy element in a broader package. Fiscal consolidation has to be a must in the package. Then removing quantitative import restriction has to be part of it. Then monetary policy, we have to get rid of this misinterpretation of new monetary theory and say that the central bank should continue to expand money supply. All these errors had to be rectified together. That's the basic point relating to exchange rate. Actually, countries have done well under different exchange rate regimes, where simply because other complementary policies make the overall policy package work. Therefore, one should not place too much emphasis on one element. We should not forget the Timbergen rule. Then the second question is how to achieve central bank autonomy. Actually, partly it has to come as part of change in the political culture in the economy. And the politicians need to understand that if you want to run the country properly, we need central bank autonomy. We had more independent treasury and finance ministry. Say, we have gone to IMF 60s. In none of these time, finance minister went to the cabinet to get approval, right? And Dr. N.M. Perra, he was the finance minister of the left-wing government in the 70s. He took the decision by talking to the treasury boss. He was a strong man at that time, Rajendran, central bank governor. There was a visionary central bank governor, Tendokon, at that time. And the treasury people, they took that decision. You don't go to the cabinet and each and every member of the party to ask whether we should go to the IMF, right? It is a technical decision that has to be made at the highest priority level. And again, abolishing the Civil Service Commission as part of the constitution reform in 1992 was one of the causes of the institutional decay in the country. Before that, we had a strong civil service and it was not susceptible to political whims and fancies. And it was changed in that constitutional reform, and the permanent secretaries change all the time with the government change and all these things. And then in Indonesia, 30 years ago, Indonesia was considered a blanket case. People thought that Indonesia does not have a future. Now look at Indonesia's takeoff over the last 2 decades. Why? The central bank is manned by qualified people. Some of them are our graduates, to tell you the truth, right? And the finance minister is a well-trained World Bank economist, right? And in the treasury, we have young blood. And the politicians respect these people. And somebody had asked the question, it is not the politicians, but economists who should take the blame. Actually, we have qualified economists. There are 19 PhDs at the central bank. I conducted the workshop with them a few years ago. They are brilliant, but how can they work in this political environment? If political stooges are appointed to the headship and others, they have political motives, you can't achieve. The political culture has to change in this country. Politicians have to have a vision, not simply thinking about the next election. Now, that is the solution. Say, look at Philippines. That is a president. Actually, he did a lot of extrajudiciary killing and all that, right? But he never touched the central bank. He never appointed stooges to the planning commission. Some of our friends, we always talk to them, they operate there. but the country is doing relatively well, better than us. It is part of the political culture. And I have been studying the academic qualifications of politicians, how it changed since independence. And you can, I mean, it is, when you look at some of the changes, actually, you feel sorry for the country. And in Indonesia, there's a minimum education requirement for a person to contest an election. This type of thing has to come to and change our political culture. That is my response to these few questions. And then IMF package. What is the alternative? There is no other alternative. The most important thing at this stage, as Lal pointed out, is to open up our access to world capital market. Even developed countries like Australia, they borrow in capital market from time to time to smooth out their expenditure. Therefore, you can't avoid doing that. Now, that cannot be achieved without IMF agreement. And then IMF agreement is not only easy money. They will give about 2.5 billion at an interest rate of 2 not at 8.5%. But when that is happen, we have access to Paris Club negotiators. A friend of mine close to the Japanese government told me, Japan Central Bank has directly told our politicians they are not going to support. Japan has been one of our most benevolent donors. They are not going to support us without an IMF package. Even India is telling that. Therefore, harnessing resources from other countries depend on IMF agreement. And again, frankly, in our political system, there's misconception about IMF. I have read some of the papers written by top economists in the country, misleading interpretation about IMF dictating terms, which is not the case. And I have written a long article on these issues. We have degrees of freedom to negotiate our thing. And then IMF is not going to come and say, cut this and that expenditure. They will ask you to achieve fiscal consolidation. Deciding policy option is our role, right? Reforming some of the, now actually the IMF is in favor of universal pension scheme if possible. In some countries, they advocate this type of policies. And it is up to us to implement the reform. They will come up with the broader guidelines. And therefore, entering into IMF agreement is a must at this stage. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think we spent about extra 45 minutes already, but it is still worthwhile. But given the interest of everyone, I think if there is any other important question, we will send those questions to Dr. Veerasinghe and Professor Athukorala, so that you can give a short, brief answer to them, and then we will post it in our repository, our website, so that those who are interested to know about these things, they can get the feedback from the two presentations. So I think it was a very successful seminar in my view, because our objective is to understand the causes of this crisis. I think it was very complex thing, as these two excellent economists explained to us. Economy is a system. You cannot just take one little element and correct here, correct there. You have to look at the entire system, and then you have to consistently monitor the system where the things are going wrong. If one goes wrong, it spread to the other sector, and then whole thing can collapse. Now, if you look at the causes of this current crisis, we had these imbalances for a long time. We had an unsustainable budget deficit. We had the current account deficit. and then we recklessly borrow from the international market to cover some of these things. And then we never thought about rational policy over time. These are 20, 30 years of problems. So the inevitable question come to anybody's mind is that what kind of economic governance we had? What we were doing when all these things are happening. And then, people, happy come, happy go, this borrowed money for salary increases, various projects and all these, even I think for election campaign and so on. So eventually we can not avoid talking about the overall governance, the politics and corruption, the political culture change. Eventually we come to that. Without that kind of a political culture change, I don't think we can ever have an independent central bank. So long as our political leaders don't respect and really take the right advice from the right people after institutionalizing these things, I think we cannot resolve this. These are actually much bigger issue than fixing the exchange rate or interest rate or other technical matters, because we need some changes in our from our public also. So that I think also we have to address at some point, but at least we started a good process. And let me thank two eminent economists for spending their valuable time on this course. I am really thankful, and on behalf of the three economic associations, I would like to express my thankfulness to both of you as well as for the participants. And then I think I will end this seminar now. We will upload all the presentations and the questions and other materials for those who really want to get back to us, or those who were not able to come and listen to these important two sessions. And our next seminar will be, we have not decided the date yet, but we will have it within a week or so. So we will likewise, we will have a series of these webinars covering entire spectrum of the policy reforms. We'll go to the state-owned enterprises, we'll talk about FDIs and talk about the institutions which are preventing SDIs coming to our country. We'll talk about various other issues like state-owned tax reforms and so on. We have a long list of things, but we will prioritize based on our discussion with our inner group, and we will conduct this seminar series. And also we kindly request the resource persons, if possible, to give us a write-up about your presentations. Otherwise, based on your record of your presentation and the PowerPoint, we will draft something and send it to you if you're too busy, so that you can edit and send it back. So we try to compile these, and then at some point in time, we will appoint a sort of editorial board of 3 to 5 senior economists to put it together as a first draft, and then we will go through a consultation process and so on. So all these are in mind. These actions will come later on, and up to now I will, this is in our mind. We will actively work on that. And finally, thanking to everybody, I will conclude this seminar.